before I dive into the research findings, I did want to make sure that everyone on the call is familiar with Dodge. I hope by this point most people know at least the Dodge Construction Central, that we are the first construction marketing collaboration platform. I'm pretty sure a lot of people on the call should also be familiar with Suites as a source of information about building products. I myself am fit into that middle column, specifically in the market research and industry insights trends. And specifically what I do is my team conducts research on key trends that are transforming the construction industry. We conduct that research with major industry players like owners, architects, contractors, and we publish those findings because we partner with people like Autodesk, with companies like Autodesk, with other companies to bring this key information out into the industry. And you can see the kind of topics that we cover. A key thing to remember is that all of our reports are available for free download at www.construction.com, including the one I'm about to discuss with you. So this World Green Building Trends is the latest in a series of studies that started way back in 2008. We then followed up with a 2012, a 2016, and now the 2018 study. And every time we've done it, we've had more and more participants, so that now the current study reflects over 2,000 responses from 86 countries. And we had 19 countries individually analyzed, which are listed in the bullets below. And the survey participants included a really good representation of architectural firms, and then a solid representation of engineers, contractors, and owners. A pretty big specialist consultant group responded as well. The report itself features the data from this. It looks at multiple years of green market activity, influences, benefits, and green products and services. And we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive in this particular webinar on the green market activity, influences, and benefits sections. It also includes, in addition to an overview in general of all the data findings, the report also features individual country and regional profiles. So, for instance, we have regions like North America featured, where you can compare the findings between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. We have another section on Europe, which compares the findings from Norway, the UK, Ireland, Spain, to look at, and then Germany, to look at what they had to say. We have a couple of case studies that fall in our green technology section. And that green technology section is something that's kind of new. We looked at insights from 10 global green technology experts on the latest trends and advancements impacting building performance. I know that a lot of people on this call are very interested in how technology is transforming the industry, and certainly the relationship between technology and green has been a mutually beneficial one, where advances in technology have helped improve performance on green building, and the desire to improve performance on green building have helped create the need for those advances. So we see a lot of interesting playback about that, and that is covered in some of these technology experts. So I do recommend that you download a copy of the report, which again, I want to repeat, is available at www.construction.com, and I believe will also be shared with all the people who signed up for this. And we really could not do any of this research without the help of our partners. Carrier has been a partner on this research progress from the beginning. So we've been really excited to work with them. The AIA and Autodesk were also premier partners on this study, and the U.S. Green Building Council came in as a contributing partner, and the World Green Building Council came in as a premier research partner. They were really important in making sure we got that global coverage that we did in the responses. So we're going to dive into the data now. Just a few notes before we dive in is I'm going to be giving you the global findings. I'm also going to be doing a deeper dive, given this audience, on the U.S. and how the U.S. compares. We can learn a lot about the U.S. market from the way that it contrasts with the rest of the global market. It gives us a deeper understanding of what's going on here. So I've really targeted this presentation on understanding the U.S. market better. And that also includes doing a deeper dive than what you can find in the report on what different players in the U.S. said. We had a really robust response from the U.S. So in addition to the overall findings, we're able to compare what owners, contractors, architects, and engineers said, and I will be doing some of that as well. So first, though, to look at just what the report as a whole reveals about the green building activity, we provided the participants with a definition of green building, and that definition is of a green project. That definition's on the slide. I'm not going to read all the way through it, but you can see what they were asked to consider when they evaluated whether or not their work is green. And then based on that definition, we asked them to say what percentage of their projects met that definition currently, which is the 2018 pair of columns, and what level of activity they anticipated in the next 3 years. And you can see that, as we've seen in previous studies in the past, there is still a big shift to making projects more green. We've always seen a decline in those who are either exploring or doing 1 to 15% of their projects green consistently across the board when we've asked them about now versus what they expect in the future. One of the really striking things about this particular study, though, and it's slightly different from what we saw in the past, is that where we see the most expected growth is in those expecting to do more than 60% of their projects green. Those who expect to do the bulk of their work green, it grows from just 27% reporting that now to 47% expecting that in the future. Now, I do want to be careful when you look at this data. You have to understand that this is just what they anticipate doing. This is not a forecast based on different market factors, but it does gauge really effectively the level of commitment and enthusiasm for green that we see out in the industry. And I think it really demonstrates that there is an expectation that green is going to continue to grow. So to dig a little deeper on those findings, again, it's the same 2018 to 2021 data represented here. Now, though, it's just people who are in that top category who said that they're either doing or will do more than 60% of their projects green. You can see that Australia, Hong Kong, and Ireland right now have the top level of people, the top percentage of people who say they're doing more than 60% green projects. The U.S. falls in the middle at 32%, significantly below Australia and China and Hong Kong, but still well above a lot of the other participants, so nicely in the middle. When we look to the future expectations, Australia still expects to be on top with 64%, and Norway meets them there. There's a really strong level of commitment to green in Norway. We also see that high level of participation expected in Spain and the UAE. In the U.S., though, we see a far more moderate level of growth. Certainly, there is an expectation that more of them will be doing this high level of green projects and are currently doing it now, but we don't see quite the high levels of growth that we see in a lot of the other regions reporting around the country, around the globe. All right, so let's dig a little deeper into that in terms of what U.S. companies are doing. Again, the bars just represent those who say they're doing more than 60% green projects. Here I've added on an extra data point, which is what percentage they thought they were doing in 2015. So in 2015, you can see that when it comes to U.S. owners, when you compare them to global owners, there was a slightly higher percentage doing this intense level of green projects in the U.S. than there was globally. But by 2018, we already see that shift where far more owners globally are reporting they're doing most of their projects green versus those in the U.S., and we see that shift become more extreme by 2021. Among the architects, we see a similar pattern, although here you can see that even in the current 2018, there's a notably higher percentage of U.S. architects who report doing a high level of green than their global counterparts, both in 2015 and in 2018. By 2021, we still see a higher percentage of U.S. architects than the global average, but we see them very close, really not a notable difference between the two. Among engineers, again, we see U.S. engineers in 2015 and 2018 were at a much higher percentage reporting that they're doing this high level of green work. But by 2021, again, the global percentage exceeds that of that in the U.S. And among contractors, again, only in 2015 do we see the contractors exceeding the global average by a significant percentage. By 2018, contractors are already reporting about the same levels as their global counterparts, and by 2021, we see the global percentage much higher. So I think when you look at the overall patterns here, it not only supports the previous overall finding, but it really does demonstrate that the U.S. really needs to pay attention to where it's at globally in terms of green if it wants to stay a green leader globally. When we look at the sectors in which they're expecting to do new green projects in the next 3 years, the top sector globally is new commercial construction. By far the highest percentage, over half globally, say that they think they will do a green new commercial construction project in the next 3 years. And while the U.S. doesn't factor, the countries you see listed next to that circle are those with the 5 countries with the highest percentage who expect to be doing new commercial construction as opposed to, anything else. So 73% of the respondents in Norway say they think they'll do a new commercial green construction project in the next 3 years, and 61% in Vietnam and Spain say that. You can see the U.S. isn't up there, but still, new commercial construction is also the top sector for the U.S. However, I did want to share with you a few sectors where the U.S. does show up in the top 5 in terms of the type of work that they're expecting to do. Certainly with new institutional construction, the U.S. is well above, with 45% of the U.S. respondents expecting to work in this sector in doing green. That's well above the 38% average globally, although it is significantly below the 60% who expect to be working in that sector in Canada, where that really is the dominant sector. When it comes to the retrofit of green buildings, the U.S. is notably, again, with half of the U.S. respondents expecting to do green retrofits, notably above the 37% globally. And commercial interiors, while a little bit less, still the U.S. shows up in that top 5 with 30% as opposed to 24% globally. So we see a real emphasis on retrofits, on commercial and institutional construction, and on commercial interiors in the U.S. The other categories that were offered in that were things like high-rise residential, low-rise residential, single-family homes, green communities. There we see the U.S. performing significantly lower than their global counterparts for the most part. So let's look at what's driving all that level of green activity. First, globally, we can see that the top triggers globally are client demands and environmental regulations, but that there's still about a quarter of the respondents pick among their top triggers that they want to do healthier buildings, that it's the right thing to do, that market demands are driving it, and that lower operating costs are important. So to compare the U.S. to the global responses, I thought for triggers, it was best to start with the owners, because often it's the owner who determines exactly what level of green commitment is going to happen in a project, what they're willing to fund, and what their goals are in terms of sustainability. So it's important to understand U.S. owners' priorities when it comes to green. And certainly the triggers up till now that have encouraged them to do new green building includes lower operating costs, where we see they're well above the global average, that U.S. owners are far more concerned with lowering their operating costs and feel that that's an important trigger for green. We also see healthier buildings as a stronger influence in the U.S. than it is globally. And then down at the bottom of the chart, you can see that for the U.S. owners are much higher in terms of the percentage who select higher ROI as a key trigger than the global owners. The only area where the U.S. is significantly less influenced than the other owners are globally is environmental regulations, which falls much further back for the U.S. owners than it does globally. All right, so that's how the U.S. owners compare globally. Well, how does the U.S. market look in terms of these triggers for the other players, and how do they compare to the owners? Well, we can see that first. Let's take a look at architects. The architects are the brownish bar. You can see that lower operating costs for architects are not really a key trigger for green building. Obviously, client demands are. You're going to see client demands being higher for all the players than for the owners for obvious reasons, since the owners frequently are the clients themselves. But it's interesting to look at that one next to it, market demands. The U.S. architects see a much higher level of market demands than the owners do. They're also more influenced by environmental regulations than are the owners, and much less influenced by seeing the buildings have a higher ROI. When it comes to engineers, operating costs are far more important to the engineers than they are to the architects, but still not quite as important as they are to the owners. We still see market demands being a bigger driver among the engineers than among the owners, and we see higher ROI staying lower. The right thing to do, though, engineers are not as influenced by that as either owners or architects. And then finally, when we look at the contractors and how they compare, again, client demands really important for driving the contractors to do new green building. Environmental regulations really, for the contractors and the architects in particular, are far more important than for the other players. Surprisingly, the contractors in this particular study do not reference lower operating costs as frequently as the owners do. That is different than other studies we've seen in the past. And we see a surprisingly high level of contractors who are aware of healthier buildings as an important trigger, and doing the right thing as an important trigger for green building. All right, so those are the key overall triggers, but we also ask in the study about social reasons for building green, and we've been doing this since the 2012 study. Interestingly, they are allowed to select up to the top three. That's what these percentages represent. They represent those who said, we consider this one of the top three social reasons that we think is important and influences our decision to build green. Now, they don't have to select three. They can just select one or two or three. And that's important when you look at this, because the options, except for adding on improved health, occupant health and well-being, that got lost in 2015, was asked about in 2012, and it was asked again about in 2018. Except for that, the options have pretty much remained the same. But what we see, first we see that promotes improved occupant health and well-being and encouraging sustainable business practices are the most influential and have been the most influential consistently across the 3 years. But interestingly, when we look at the other social drivers for green, we see that all of them have increased notably since 2012, and some of them have increased, in fact, since 2015. So it's interesting that social reasons in general seem to be playing a much bigger role, that far more of the respondents, the only way to explain this data is that far more of the respondents are selecting 2 or 3 as their top reasons rather than just one. And so we do see that social reasons are becoming bigger drivers for green. When we take a deeper look at improves occupant health and well-being, which was, again, remember, one of the top social drivers, we can see that the U.S. is really a major factor in why it ranks so high, with 79% overall U.S. respondents saying that they think that improving occupant health and well-being is one of their top 3 reasons. The other 2 countries are Ireland and Colombia, where it ranked that highly. And when we look at all of the social reasons for building green across the U.S., broken out by the players, we see that there's a lot of correspondence in terms of the influence of the social reasons for building green, definitely between the U.S. owners and the architects. Pretty strong correspondences there, really no daylight between them. We see the engineers, for the most part, are a bit lower on a few. They're a little bit less likely to recognize the importance of health and well-being, especially as compared to the owners. They are also not quite as enthusiastic about encouraging sustainable business practices, but they do think worker productivity is a key factor. And they rank notably below the owners and architects in terms of the importance of creating a sense of community, having an aesthetically pleasing building, or in supporting the domestic economy as being top reasons. And then when it comes to the contractors, well, they really do even exceed the owners and the architects in terms of the importance of green to support the domestic economy. We still see them mostly corresponding to the engineers' responses, except for that note on increasing worker productivity, where they value that significantly less than all of the other three players. And, we saw that drop by the contractors, especially compared to the owners and architects, pretty much across the board. Just to be clear, this isn't something that's inherent in the nature of being contractors. This is something specific to the U.S. contractors. When we compare the U.S. contractor responses to global contractor responses, we see that globally, contractors tend to rank the importance of health, encouraging sustainable business practices, increasing worker productivity, creating a sense of community, and being aesthetically pleasing much higher than their U.S. counterparts. We also ask about the environmental reasons for building green, and the report features what they rank in their top three. We ask them first to rate what's important and very important, and then we ask them to rank those things that they considered important and very important to understand which ones emerge at the top. And I do encourage you to go to the report if these are critical to you. For the purposes of this webinar, though, I really wanted to focus on the fact that pretty much when you compare the U.S. findings to the global findings, when they're just rating all of these across the board on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not all important, 4 is important, and 5 is very important, we can see that most of the respondents, both in the U.S. and globally, rate all of these environmental reasons as important reasons to build. But however, the U.S. does fall a little bit behind global in rating most of these. And in fact, when it comes to ranking, they land up ranking energy consumption much higher than any of the other factors. And where the biggest differential is between the U.S. and global is for lower greenhouse gas emissions, where that's a much lower priority it's much less likely to be rated as important or very important by U.S. respondents in general than by their global counterparts. And when we look at how that breaks out amongst the different players, you can see that among architects, they're pretty consistent with the global findings. They really do feel that lowering greenhouse gas emissions are very important. And engineers are pretty close to that too. It's really the owners and the contractors who do not prioritize greenhouse gas emissions as much as they prioritize some of the other environmental reasons for building green. All right, so we've looked at how much activity there is. We've looked at what's driving people to build green. Now let's look at what's stopping them from building green. And again, we're going to go back to looking at how this study compares to some of the previous ones we've conducted. When we've asked about the top barriers to green building, back in 2012, 76% said that they thought that higher first costs were the top barrier. By 2015, that had gone down to 50%. We see it at 49% now in 2018. When you just have two data points, it's hard to know whether you're seeing a true shift or whether you're seeing something that's just a blip in the data. But certainly, the 2018 findings confirm that a real shift occurred between 2012 and 2015, and that higher first costs, whether they're perceived or actual, are no longer the single critical obstacle. Now, that said, they're still the top obstacle. Even at 49%, they still rank as the top obstacle. But now, really, it's not just a question of if we can just solve this higher first cost issue. We do have to pay attention to some of the other things that are preventing the market from growing even more. We see lack of political support and incentives comes in as second. But when it comes to the top barriers, though, we do see very strong differences by country in terms of what's important. And in the U.S., in case some of you who just work in the U.S. market are going, wait a minute, I feel like higher first costs really do still seem to be a pretty big obstacle in my market, you're absolutely correct. In the U.S., it still ranks in the low 70 percentiles as the top barrier for U.S. respondents for them doing more green building. You can see that's well above the global average. There is a bit of a drop in the U.S. from 2012, but nothing like what we see globally. And in the U.S., higher first costs is still a critical issue. And you can see that the U.S. isn't alone in that in terms of developed green markets. In Australia and Norway, while nowhere near as critical as in the U.S., it still ranks well above the global average. So it appears it may be tied, based on some of this data, to the cost of construction in general in some of these markets. Although Colombia, it's still very high too, and construction costs aren't that high in Colombia. Where we see it not at all important, surprisingly, are some of the developing markets, places like India and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It ranks pretty low compared to some of the other barriers. With some of the other barriers to look at, because cost is so important and is selected by so many in the U.S., other barriers, the U.S. tends to fall significantly below the global averages. So lack of political support and incentives, 33% is the global average, really critical in a lot of developing markets like Vietnam and Colombia and Brazil, also really important in Spain. Far less important in the U.S., Germany, and really almost not important at all in Singapore. When it comes to lack of public awareness, again, this is not a critical factor in the U.S., only 19% selected compared to the 32% globally, and it is really important in markets like India, Poland, and UAE. I did want to look at market demand, though, because when you look through the various barriers to green building across the different U.S. respondents, this is the only one where there really was a notable difference in terms of the responses by player. So it is considered, lack of market demand is considered a pretty big barrier by contractors in particular, and also by architects. It is not considered a particularly big barrier by owners. And this is sort of an interesting data point, because if you remember back a few slides, the owners also did not feel it was as important of a driver as the other factors. So what this suggests is that the U.S. owners are not really making their decisions about whether or not to build green based on market demand. It's neither a driver nor an obstacle to them. Whereas architects in particular and contractors really feel like this is something that's needed to drive the market, that market demand is a far more critical factor. All right, so let's move on to the benefits of green building. Again, we're going to look across the global studies. In general, we see lower operating costs is still the top barrier, top benefit, as it was in 2012. But again, we see lower operating costs drop overall in terms of its importance. And we see just a generally looser spread, fewer things rising to the top, although I do want to point out that we added in improved occupant health and well-being as a benefit that they could select this year. We didn't ask about that previously, and as you can see, it performed as the second highest, second only to lower operating costs. So that issue of health, this study really reinforces, is a huge global driver for green at this point, and it is one of the most important benefits that people are expecting from their green buildings. We also see some strength in terms of higher point of value at sale and future-proofing assets, some of the economic benefits. When we ask, well, what metrics are you using to quantify green buildings? We only asked about this in 2015 and 2018. We didn't ask about this in 2012, so we just have the 2 points of comparison here. But mostly, lower operating costs are what are being measured for the most part. We see some measurement of the use of documentation and certification to provide quality assurance. And we actually saw a drop in terms of measurement of higher value at point of sale between 2018 and 2015. And a full quarter of the respondents are not using metrics to actively track performance options at all. And I do want to take a little bit of a closer look, not at those who aren't doing it, but really looking at where the highest level of metric measurement activity is going on. and where the lowest are? Because it's not necessarily intuitive, if you look at the far right here, that the lowest level of use is often coming from the most established green markets: Australia, Germany, Norway, the US, the UK. These are well-established markets, and it does suggest that metrics are not considered that important to justify green building. Where are they in high or very high use? And used by over 80% of respondents? In India, in China, in Mexico, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Vietnam. It's largely the developing markets, especially the markets out in Asia and in the Middle East, that really are putting emphasis on understanding the metrics behind green building. Singapore, of course, is a very well-developed green market, but Singapore has requirements about metrics, so that is probably why they land up falling in so high in terms of the areas where metrics are being measured. When we look at the benefits reported, it's best to look at what the owners report on the benefits, because these are specific financial benefits that would accrue to the owners. And we see that the U.S. owners largely correspond to global owners in terms of the benefits they see from lower operating costs. That U.S. owners report about a 7% lower operating cost over 12 months, and global owners report about an 8% lower operating costs. Those percentages are also pretty consistent all the way back to 2012. That is about the level of operating costs over 12 months that we've seen. Interesting, though, when you look at the estimated operating cost over 5 years, globally, the global owners see a lot higher percentage than the U.S. owners. The U.S. owners are far more conservative about the 5-year benefits that they're seeing. We also see global owners pretty optimistic about asset value increase. A full 7%, they expect to see a full 7% of asset value increase when they build a building green versus when it's a traditional building. And even with the U.S. owners, 5% is still a pretty healthy payback for making that initial investment in green, that the building is worth 5% more just because it's green. We do see that the U.S. in general has slightly higher payback periods than do the global owners. They anticipate about 9 years. Global owners see it about 7 years. These are still relatively high payback periods for some of these sectors like hospitality and commercial office, where buildings tend to turn over faster than this payback period. So that is still possibly a slight dampening effect on the overall green market, and something that we need to think about and address moving forward. We asked the same thing. That was all new green construction. We also asked the same questions about green renovations, and we see very similar patterns emerging between the U.S. owners and the global owners, where they're pretty close in terms of the percentage of lower operating costs they see over 12 months, but that the global owners are a little bit more optimistic when it comes to the 5-year paybacks. Although the U.S. owners, remember that green renovations are a big area of investment in the U.S., and possibly the fact that they see a much more robust payback for over 5 years compared to the new buildings suggests that that might be one of the factors that's driving these green retrofits. The average payback period for U.S. owners is 7 years. For global owners, it's 6 years, which is getting pretty close to that major 5-year milestone.